Gurave Gaur Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadave Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhubheva Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. My Dandavat Pranam devotees. So I'm in a continuum of bringing out some points regarding a recent protracted conversation I had regarding sort of relativism, academia, and its divergence from the path of bhakti. As I already mentioned previously, wherever there is a synthesis with bhakti, then bhakti, academia can walk hand in hand. And where there is a divergence, it becomes a matter of the reposing of faith as to where you will align. So, first let me describe that faith itself is a power. Faith is a power which has a direct effect on consciousness. For instance, it's described in Shastra, Shraddha Anupayani Varajam Bhakti Unmukhi Chitta Vritti Visesh. So the nature of the power of Shraddha has an ability that is so strong that it can accomplish even what a jivatma in the conditioned world could not accomplish on their own. So referencing a verse in the 11th canto, Anadi Avidya Yuktasha Purushasha Vedatmanam Swato Na Sambhavanti Anya Gyanatva Ganado Bhavet. Here this verse is saying that the jiva who's been bound to avidya from anadikal, swato na sambhavanti, cannot affect their own extrication, but it requires anya, it requires another. So, gyanatva ganado bhavet. So that person who is both realized and merciful to have the disposition of giving transcendental knowledge, which awakens faith, that person is needed to break the cycle of absorption in the material energy. So what faith can do, even the jiva themselves could not do. Just by the installation or awakening of faith in the association of a realized person, faith has the ability to completely transform the chitta or consciousness and make it unmuk, means turn towards the inner reality and away from the conditioned reality that was based in avidya or ignorance. So faith is an extremely powerful phenomenon. So in reference to our discussion, when we come across things which diverge from the conclusion of Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra, which are the spiritual repositories of faith for those who want to obtain, because everything also, I don't want to go off my point, but everything is also according to perception. What is a person's current perception? What is their aspired perception? Means what do you want to realize or not realize? All of these things are factors. So I'll try to cover that a little more as we go along, but I just wanted to bring up that point. So where you repose your faith, in the case of those who aspire to unfoldment, enlightenment, realization, in Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra. This is cross-traditional boundaries. On the other hand, if a person either does not know, does not desire the nature of unfolding in terms of spiritual realization, then there is the tendency to repose faith in those things which are more in their immediate purview, their own intellectual capacity, their own historical experience, etc. So it's not a matter of the absence of faith on either side of the equation. It's a question of where the faith is reposed. So I will give an example. In the context of the recent discussion, there was the idea that Srimad Bhagavatam, and this was the original post, I'm using it as an example. There were many things which were subsequent to that, but I'll go back to that just as an example. Now, Srimad Bhagavatam is dated to be around 1,000 years old. So I brought up the fact that, first of all, we have to define what is meant by Srimad Bhagavatam. Secondly, we have to source what is reliable information regarding the history of Srimad Bhagavatam. Third, we have to then act on whichever source material we have faith in. Because if you declare that faith is only the prospect of those who will accept Guru, Sada, and Sastra, we say no. Because you're also placing faith in some mentorial capacity for those who you align with. You're also placing faith in the documentation they produce. So you're accepting Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra in the material paradigm. So, for instance, when it came to discussing source material for proving whether or not Srimad Bhagavatam is actually dated at 1,000 years old, of course, this is even before we get to a discussion on defining Srimad Bhagavatam. I mentioned that the greatest source material for explaining the history of Srimad Bhagavatam is Srimad Bhagavatam itself. I think I've already explained on a previous video that proposition was met with the response that it was circular reasoning, which is part of the rules of logic that were developed by Aristotle. So, of course, immediately it would be concluded then that so your faith is then placed in the rules of Aristotle and subsequent followers of Aristotle who accept that doctrine, as opposed to the statements of Sastra, because that's what it boils down to. It's not like there's like some way to patchwork that ideal. If you say Srimad Bhagavatam is not the prominent and prime source of vetting itself because of a philosophical rule developed by someone who we don't really know what the nature of their spiritual realization was, we know their place in history regarding philosophy. From what I understand, Aristotle believed in God. What his level of experience and realization was, especially in regards to Srimad Bhagavatam, how will we know that? You understand? So, if you repose faith in somebody, as opposed to the very book itself, the very Sastra itself, then that is a divergence from the path of bhakti. And more than that, I don't understand the logic that will be there in taking prominence of where to repose your faith based on material dynamics as opposed to spiritual dynamics. Because again, we have to come back to the point, what is Srimad Bhagavatam? Srimad Bhagavatam is the realization in maturation of the author, Vyasadeva, who in the depth of his transcendent experience born from practice, Bhakti Yogena Manasi Samyak Pratihile Amale Apashat Purusham Purnam Yogamaya Pashitam, in which he saw completely the nature of transcendence in the highest capacity. That is actually Srimad Bhagavatam. So, if you're discussing that conclusion, that realization of Vyasadeva, that existed way prior to Vyasadeva. But even if you're discussing historically the period of time in which Vyasadeva manifested Srimad Bhagavatam, then still you'd have to date it according to descriptions in Srimad Bhagavatam, given by Vyasadeva himself. So, of course, we know that at least Vyasadeva was a contemporary during the time of Sri Krishna, because it's mentioned that he obviously was able to be called by, it's not coming back to my mind from Mahabharata now. During the time of Vitravirya, let me see, I'm not thinking now, I'm not remembering, but he was called to continue the line or the dynasty, right, of the Kauravas because of the death of Pandu and the fact that Dhritarashtra was blind. So we know that then he existed during the time of Lord Krishna because they were all contemporary during that time. We know the history of that period to be at least 5,000 years or more. So that would date Srimad Bhagavatam, unless we're describing that it was written later or something, right? And even if you say it was written after the departure of Lord Krishna, then you could date the meetings both of Maharaj Parikshit and Shukdev Goswami, who spoke it, which was after it was written. He spoke it to Maharaj Parikshit, who was the great-grandson, right? Or he was the grandson of Arjuna, right? Which was also during the time of Krishna. Krishna personally entered the womb of Uttar to save Maharaj Parikshit. So you're still dating around that time. So that's even if you're taking the compilation of Srimad Bhagavatam. So 1,000 years certainly doesn't line up with that. But then a question may be raised, Mukunda, who said it was dated at 1,000 years? Well, of course, that is some accommodations. Some people have mentioned one person, a Professor Flood, right, who's an Indologist. He's written some book on Introduction to Hinduism or something, right? And there may be others. But the point being, we're still back to why it is not vetted by Srimad Bhagavatam itself. If you wanted to know something about someone, who is a better person to give information about themselves than the person? How would vetting a person be better done by speaking to someone else to try to vet a person when you have access to the person? Now, we're not talking circumstantial here. I've worked in law enforcement as a career. So I know in some cases, if somebody's being duplicitous, obviously you may go to someone else to get more insight so you can get an overall picture. But that's not what we're discussing here. We're discussing all things being considered on the table of full honesty, which we have no reason not to suggest in this particular example. Then the source itself would be the best vetting mechanism. Now we also have in Srimad Bhagavatam the statement that Vyasadeva writes that Tane Brahmarida Adhikavaye, that actually the inspiration or the expansion, Tane means like tenoti, to expand, to expire, to infuse, was infused in the heart, and what was infused was Brahman. Brahman here means spiritual teaching, spiritual reality. Our acharyas have translated Rasa Brahman, the nature of what is transcendental spiritual reality and the dynamic of prem and ras, etc. That was infused in the heart of Brahma in the beginning of the creation. Adhikavi means, one meaning is Brahma. So here now we have a dating of Srimad Bhagavatam as what it essentially is, which is the manifestation or revelatory power regarding illuminating what is love of God. That was in the beginning of the creation. So now even if you want to use the scientific models of what dates the creation, then you're still way beyond 1,000 years. So here my point is really that there is no way to understand spiritual reality by trying to force it into the purview of material intelligence. There are just so many verses. There's just so many verses which point out that you cannot force spiritual reality into the purview of material intelligence. And I was speaking to my wife early this morning, and I was mentioning that in part, there are two phenomena at play. One is the continuum of God play. The idea that somehow or another, I am not ready to surrender to the idea of an absolute truth in which I don't really have a say. That I am a product, or I can be only a product, of the descent of revelatory power. No, I'm not willing to accept that. In the model of God play, there's the idea that my ascending prowess based on my intelligence and bolstered by false egoism will allow me access to whatever is actually truth simply on the basis of my intellectual capacity. Now, that may be bolstered by the enthusiasm and fan club base that arises from others who think like that. But the reality has borne out that it's not possible. A subsequent conversation regarded the nature of enlightenment, and an idea by a particular author of that post that the nature of enlightenment was a myth, essentially, that enlightened beings are a myth. But the author admitted themselves that they were not enlightened. They also admitted that, that they themselves are not enlightened, and that even if there is such a thing, as enlightenment, it would be irrelevant to everyone because it takes being enlightened to understand enlightenment. So just again, let me follow this chain of thought. One, you need to be enlightened to understand what is enlightenment. There's self-admission that I'm not enlightened, and there's a conclusive statement, enlightened beings are a myth. So in the course of the exchange of conversation, the idea came up, perhaps it's just my language and my inability to express it in English. But that's a pretty clear statement, and it's pretty representative of what must be the thought process behind what you're saying. But it's obviously contradictory as logic. If you're declaring that it requires being enlightened to understand what is enlightenment, and you are not enlightened, what is the basis of being able to make an absolute statement about enlightenment? And so this is what I'm saying. There is no stairway to heaven. Due respect to Led Zeppelin. There is no stairway to heaven. You can't ascend by intellectual prowess into the realm of what is aprakrit. Aprakrita vastu, na prakrita gochara. It is not possible to force your way into the realm of what's beyond your material makeup. You have to submit to the descent of revelatory power. And there's a process for that. So it's not like that's something being stated and there's no vehicle for it. There is a vehicle for it, and it's crossed traditional boundaries. If you look at any tradition of antiquity, you will find both revelation, revelatory power, and the nature of the process of submission to acquire that revelatory power. Whether you're talking about Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, whatever you're talking about, ancient Vedic cosmology. I lived in Africa for almost 9 years. In all of the traditions of Africa, it is also based on revelatory power, the descent of revelation. So it is not something also that is a minority view. It is a universal view, pretty much. But there's always been, and probably always will be, a pushback on that fact, because the idea of becoming completely submitted to something, like in the case of bhakti, where Saranagati is described as both the first anga of bhakti and the doorway to bhakti. And what is that Saranagati? Anukulyasya sankalpa, pratikulyasya vivajanam, rakshishiti gopta, rakshishiti vishwas, goptave varanam tata, and atmanikshep karpanya. I have to humble myself to the degree that I assess that my complete goal, my complete only duty, my complete self-interest is only to be dovetailed with the interest of what is favorable, anukul, to the service of God. And that which is pratikul, not aligned with that service, should be rejected. So now I'm put into a position where I'm forced to accept only revelatory doctrine. I have to guide my life and infuse my consciousness with only revelatory doctrine. That's forcing me to give up the very base of false egoism. Egoism is an amazing thing. One of the four main features of all conditioned life is eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. It is just part of conditioned life. And it exists throughout the entire animal species as well as into the human species, right? So the tendency for defending oneself is not only an external phenomenon, but it is also an internal one. In other words, the false ego is the internal defensive mechanism really against the idea of submission to the will of God. That's essentially what false egoism is. False egoism is the bolstering of a particular upadi. In Sanskrit, upadi means like a particular designation. The designations that we have are born from karma. Karma, the diving, and the train, the janta, the upapatye. That upadi is born from ashmita. Ashmita means the absence of knowledge of my actual identity. Avidya is a potency. Avidya, the absence of actual vidya, absence of actual knowledge. And the first manifestation of that avidya, or absence of knowledge, in this case knowledge referring to who I actually am, right, is called asmita, I am. So it indicates I am something other than who I actually am. I don't know who I actually am, so asmita, asmita, I am something. Then karma gives a particular karmic package infused with ahamkara, right? The concept of aham, karana, and karata. I am the doer and the cause. And because I am the doer and I am the cause, the particular upadi or karmic designation I have according to what family, race, culture, etc. I'm born into, and what individual in that collective I'm born into, that has the power of both causation and doership. This is what the false ego does. So then it produces in the psychology, sort of axiomatically, a defense mechanism against the idea of giving up the independence of that position. The false body, the false identification, the false narrative of a history of this body and what went on, and the false aspirational ideals related to this body. I will cause and do everything up till the idea of being God, right? Because all of that's based in false ego, right? Even up to the idea, I will be God. You understand? So when a prospect is offered that, no, the only way to understand enlightenment, transcendence, realization, it begins with submission in order to defang or disempower false ego, it becomes extremely difficult. And therefore, the intelligence becomes charged with the idea of searching out thousands upon millions of reasons why I don't have to do this surrendering process and give up the defense mechanism of false ego. I'm speaking on the psychology of approaching bhakti at this point, right? So it becomes extremely difficult because that is such a vulnerable state according to our conditioned history. And we always try to keep ourselves in a defensive posture. Physically, you'll see people do whatever they have to do to maintain a physical defensive posture, right? Right, I know for a fact, I worked in law enforcement as a career, right? What people do in order to create a defensive mechanism around their physical bodies. We are so dependent on medicine because to protect this body, we take shelter of all kinds of medicine, whether it's occidental, homeopathic, allopathic, whatever it might be, right? Because we're, again, by false ego, protecting this body, right? And subtly, we protect our mind and intelligence, which are the subtle body, by the false ego. And part of false egoism is, again, karana and karta, causation and doership, under the illusion that I am this false identity. And therefore, the actual position of the soul, which is called Dashoshmi. Ashmi is there. I am. Dasa. Just as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu told, Jivera Swarupoya Krishnera Nitya Dasha. Right? And the perception of suffering, which Sanatana Goswami asked the two questions, Keami, Kenemai, Jare Tapatrai. Who am I and why am I suffering? So Mahaprabhu then gives explanation of the genesis of the perception of suffering. Jivera Swarupoya Krishnera Nitya Das, Jivera Tatashta Shakti, Ved Abed Prakash. Because the jiva is Tatashta Swabhav. The jiva is in a position of marginal nature. And therefore, there's the influence either of the material energy, inclusive of the features of avidya and the hamkar, etc., and there's the influence of the internal spiritual energy, which is the revelatory power, which comes from Samvit, Sandini, and Ladini, or Swarup Shakti, which gives genuine cognition in transcendence. This is called Samvit Shakti. And it creates the platform of Sandini, spiritual existence, par excellence. And it also gives, naturally, as a result of that, Ladini or bliss potency. You understand? So, the nature of the jiva, being this Tatashta Swabhav, can be influenced by the material energy in such a way that obviously they can't extricate themselves, as I already explained, but the nature of that conditioned life gives rise to the idea of causation and doership. So there can be a continuum for lifetimes of following that influence. And by following that influence, until and unless we come to a position in which we submit to the internal energy and the potency of revelation that descends from it, it'll be impossible to understand even our own identity, what to speak of the nature of God, the cosmos, so forth and so on. The manifest revelatory power is in Sastra. If you look at the Quran, it is revelatory, the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad. In the Bible, you have revelatory descent in the form of Moses. What to speak of in every other tradition. In the Buddha, by meditation, there was enlightenment. So every single thing has a process, a revelatory descent, including revelatory power, means the power to understand based on that descending transcendent knowledge, and hence gives enlightenment in the consciousness. But it requires a process. And the beginning of that process is the acknowledgement that I am not God. And that the actual causation and doership, Janmadhyasya has all come from a source beyond myself. And actually, when you really think about it, and the reason I'm speaking on this is because it has taken hold and it has gained some footing and is actually advancing even within the Vaishnava Mandal. The many different variations of relativism that have arisen in the Vaishnava Mandal, and there's a myriad of causes for it. People who were disappointed in some aspect of institutional practice of Vaishnavism or some malpractice of Vaishnavism. Simply the nature of false egoism arising from, perhaps stimulation coming from, the academic community, right? Because you'll find many devotees, when they return to further their education, not in pursuit of a career based on the need to work or have a career or whatever, that may be part of it. But also, there's a bolstering of the false ego. Rather than a diminishing of false ego, a bolstering of false ego comes because now you find a stamp of approval from what was perceived to be those who were, whether you want to use the word enlightened or not, but those who you would consider elevated, right? And now getting that stamp of approval in the form of any varying amount of degrees or whatever, it bolsters false egoism. So the nature of an upadi is that it has it can expand, just like you get something which is pliable and it can expand it. So false egoism and the very nature of the sense of an upadi, means an artificial designation, has that capacity. So what happens is a person has some partial identification as a bhakta or bhaktin. They have a partial identification as a scholar based on the idea that that was given to me by an institution. You understand? And having put faith, having divested some faith from the revelatory descending process and having placed some in the ascending academic community and their processes, which is intellectual outreach. That's what I've called it. Intellectual outreach means to try to extend your intellectual capacity, your subtle body's intelligence, that facility, to try to extend it even beyond its jurisdiction. So, but when you get a group of people together and they validate each other, right, then you form a whole institution around that, right? And then especially if you get enough people who you stamp with a paper, this degree, that degree, this degree, that degree, and they function in the material arena in some specified capacity. Science, art, poetry, philosophy, whatever it might be, right? And we give credence to that status, right? We, just like, I'll give you an example. We give credence and status to the most insignificant things. We will take advice from people who would play with balls for a living. Basketballs, golf balls, baseballs, footballs. They're used in many cases for advocacy of something. It doesn't denounce their personal, status. In other words, a person could be genuinely very aware, conscious, steeped, and knowledgeable, etc., etc. But the idea of using persons who we, in our social fabric, because we're socially engineered to do so, we look up to because of the status of what they do. Playing with the ball is the most insignificant thing. But we give credence if somebody who plays with a ball comes on television and gives some opinion. There's some regard given to that for some people, right? Right? And sometimes it's not even critically filtered as to what that opinion is. But if that's the opinion of this pro athlete or that performer or that actor, actress, etc., though the very nature of what they do is insignificant, you understand? In the social fabric, entertainment is, and if you look at every culture of antiquity, you'll see that these were things which were minor forces in the overall social fabric. But we elevated these things to major status. We pay millions of dollars if somebody can play successfully with a ball. But you pay those who are charged to educate people, right, which is the essential gaining of knowledge, right, pittance in comparison. So just look at the social fabric, and that'll give you an indication of where we're at, right? So, but my point here being that when we don't align with the descending revelatory power, we cannot have true vision of those who are the mentorial succession of that kind of revelation. You understand? So another point that I obviously brought up in the thumbnail, and that's going to be kind of a segue to that, was, is it possible, right, that those who are enlightened or truly realized have 4 defects? There are 4 defects which are universally observed in conditioned souls. They make mistakes, they're subject to illusion, they have imperfect senses, and they have the tendency to cheat. Understand? And all 4 of those things are easily observable in the overall social fabric. People will very quickly speak on something they have no knowledge of. So that's both the tendency to cheat, and that's the nature of the making of mistakes. You understand? Also, people obviously have imperfect senses. Therefore, the whole idea that within the scientific community, what they can experiment on and observe becoming the absolute conclusion on something is already imbued with that fault. That's why, and of course, the nature of cheating and the nature of false egoism is that when it's discovered that something was wrong and a new theorem or new thing pops up, then it's, oh, well, this is just advancement of what was going on. And it's looked at intellectual advancement. Because that's a whole other phenomenon. That there is this theory of the cave to the microwave linear look at intellectual development. That somehow or another, we're always in the stage of advancing. You understand? But most spiritual, again, descending revelatory communities, I'll use that phrase here, they accept time as a cyclic event. Things go in cycles. So we're not in some progressive linear march from undeveloped intelligence to more advanced, and this is going to be an ever-evolving phenomenon. And I happen to be in the period right now where we're at the pinnacle of that or something. No. Absolutely not. First of all, if you look in all the ancient cosmologies, time is a cyclic event. And those cycles tend to be periods of great illumination. And for instance, now, according to Vedic cosmology, the Kali Yuga is a period of the opposite. The lack of illumination, the lack of enlightenment. Manda sumanda matayo, manda bhagyu bhadrata. Great disfortune, arguing, fights, wars, so many different things. You can look in the 12th canto Srimad Bhagavatam and go through all of the issues of Kali Yuga, and it's very evident we're not a more advanced society. You can go back, but not so long, and look in the cultures of many places. In Africa, while I was there, I did study on the ancient cultures of Ghana, Mali, right? Timbuktu, the Mali Empire, etc. Very advanced conceptions of life, etc., etc. You can go to ancient Egypt, right? And I had the chance to visit the pyramids at Giza. If you'll understand that architecture, which I don't even think can be replicated today, right? And people are still trying to figure out the mathematical arrangements and so forth of the building of the pyramids, right? And look at those cultures, right? And look at now, what is so much more advanced now? That we have a microwave? You understand? So, you know, which of course causes cancer and so many other things, but that's another story, right? I'm not getting into that, nor am I about to suggest who should use what in their individual lives. But I'm pointing out something. We're not in this progressive linear march of progress in intellectual capacity. We're simply in a cycle. And in that cycle, we're producing certain kinds of, effect. That's it. But actually, the only true evolution of souls is when they come back in contact with that reality, that I'm soul, not the physical arrangement of karma that I have. Because everybody's basically carrying around a karmic package in the form of a body made of 5 elements, a subtle body made of 3 elements. You understand? Via a vicarious connection of the soul with these things, we're looking at all of this and saying, oh yes, we're on this progressive march. But actually, unless you have some revelation regarding your own identity, this is one of the reasons Sanatana Goswami Pad said, oh, people think I'm very learned, because of course, Rupa and Sanatana Goswami were from very high-class Brahmin families. They were very accomplished, both in language, art, culture, science, so many different things. But Sanatana Goswami said, but as an example for us, because he's an eternal associate of Bhagavan, obviously, but for us, he brought up, people say I'm learned, but I don't know who I am. So he's pointing out that this whole idea of intellectual growth in an evolving linear fashion, that's a myth. Because people are less informed about their actual spiritual identity than previously. There's more relativism regarding the absolute nature of a God. There's more dependence on intellectual outreach, as I mentioned, than there is on divine revelation, which has stood the test of time for thousands and thousands of years. So how could we see that things have progressed more? And if this is progress, then wow, then my definition of progress must have been skewed for many years. If we look at what's going on in the world today, this was predicted in Srimad Bhagavatam thousands of years ago, right? What we would see, you're seeing those things now. So even on that basis, you can accept there's some revelatory power in the writings of Srimad Bhagavatam as well as other scriptures. which all predicted the kind of things we're seeing now, because they understood the nature of cyclic time, and they understood the nature of this particular spiritual climate in this age. So the point being that we have to make a choice. Will we accept that there is a absence of those four defects? Imperfect senses, committing mistakes, the subject to being illusion, and the tendency to cheat, that does not exist in realized souls. So now, Makundi, you have to give both some evidence you've given by verses, but you also have to give some logic for that. One is the very nature of enlightenment and realization is it comes off of the platform of the material, subtle, and gross body. And it is rooted in the realization, I am the soul. The nature of the soul's identity I mentioned earlier, Daso Shmi, has direct relation to absolute truth in God. Therefore, in the consciousness of a realized soul, the only reflection of reality that's present is divine. Now, you certainly can find people who are not enlightened but claim to be enlightened, and then you will see manifestations of material faults, and you'll attribute, well, see, that's what I was talking about, right? That even those who are, quote, divine have these kind of faults. They were not divine. Another thing which was very interesting was I was, in the course of this whole conversation, one person wrote me when I inquired about the nature of the enlightenment and the fact that our Srila Prabhupada, for instance, our Guru Vargas as a whole, do not have these four defects. Those who are absolutely realized. Those who are in the progressive unfoldment to Siddhi may manifest, according to their still karmic residue, some things. But in those who are absolutely realized, they cannot commit mistakes. So he sent me a discourse of our Srila Prabhupada with one Dr. Miser, I believe it was, and he pointed out that there was a mistake in a particular conception called Swetaja. Swetaja is written both in Puranas, it's also written in Ayurveda, so it presents itself in Upanishad also. And it's the idea that there are organisms that can be born from vapors or sweat, etc. So he mentioned that Louis Pasteur had done experiments to disprove this theory, and many scientists, I guess, following suit, have disproved this theory. But then the question comes, have they actually disproved it? Because have they actually been able to observe all the circumstances that might have been there, which generated, even in Ayurveda, which is strictly medical science, right? Which would have generated the conception in the Vedas, in Upanishad, etc. Have they been able to observe all the circumstances that would have given birth to that conception? They could not possibly have. Because by intellectual outreach, the outreach only goes so far. So if you're replicating experiments, can you make every single experiment that would conclusively state that this was not possible? If you can't, you've simply reached the limit of your intellectual outreach and you've made a conclusion on that. Much like, but slightly different because there's at least some physical experiment, but much like the author of the article I spoke about earlier. You're making a declaration about something which you yourself have not experienced. So similarly here, most scientists can only do experiments which give some replication to some degree of something, but it can never be absolute because it cannot possibly cover the full spectrum of everything considered. First of all, the time period. Is there some effect based on the time period? Second of all, can you produce every single circumstance in which the theory of Swetaja would have been valid? You can't. Therefore, if I have the position where I have to choose where to repose my faith, then Louis Pasteur or whatever scientist followed after that to, quote, disprove this theory, I would still go on the side of what's mentioned in revelatory doctrine. Because those persons are still subject to make mistakes. Because until and unless you're on the platform of the soul, the possibility of these four defects is there. That's why you could have a scientist come to a conclusion only to be disproven later. You understand? Even Aristotle wrote about the concept of spontaneous generation. He also wrote about that. So now to have so many years later disproven, that would maybe bolster the idea of some kind of intellectual progress, but how many people in the intelligentsia community today would compete with Aristotle? So you understand what I'm saying? Just the whole material realm is fraught with many difficulties, and it is incapable of reaching into the domain of spiritual reality. Partly because the realm of spiritual reality is also covered to prevent insincerity of approach by those who have self-interest. Because the very nature of the ultimate spiritual paradigm is the voiding of self-interest in favor of the interest of the beloved. You understand? In other words, the pinnacle of spiritual reality is love. And the interest of the beloved is the key feature. I'm not going into details here. Right? Is the key feature of spiritual elevation in its highest realm. You understand? Therefore, the nature of giving up self-interest, which is mentioned in Srimad Bhagavatam in the second verse, paramo nimatsaranam satam, that those sadhus who are near matsarya, means they've given up, envy is one common translation, but here it indicates self-interest. Who've given up all self-interest, because envy is also born of self-interest. Understand? For them, this knowledge is made available. You understand? So I think I will conclude here. And this was not like an official class. It was just thoughts on the nature of both the conversations I've been having and also the trend of it appearing in the Vaishnav Mandal. So to some degree, it's very prominent on the periphery of the Vaishnav Mandal, but it has certainly found footing and entrance into the Vaishnav Mandal via persons who may be either circumstantially their faith has been corrupted or it just had never fully matured. You understand? And therefore it becomes difficult for them to put the fullness of faith, which is required, this is called Saranagati, at least in this process of bhakti, right? It's difficult for them to do that, right? And then, of course, the defensive mechanism of false ego will give rise to, well, I want to have scrutiny. I want to be able to question things. Questioning is not the problem. Acceptance of answers is the issue. All right, my Dandavat Pranam. Vancha Kalpaturuvesha Kripa Shinduvevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.